Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the musical traditions segment of the program, and especially I'd like to welcome the group Facing East and their leader, John Wubbenhorst.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot.
We have many musical influences here.
Yes, well, that's very true. I've always just liked to play music that I like to play, and it's led me all sorts of different places.
What styles do we have represented in this group here?
Well, specifically, I really fell in love with the bansuri right here. This is a bamboo flute, and I play it. I went to India. I spent 2 years in India, so I studied the classical music of India on the bansuri. But also, you can hear a lot of different jazz influences and from the rest of the group. And
how long has this ensemble been together?
well, we just released a CD about a month ago, and we're just starting to play our first gigs around.
Well, we have many years of musical influences here, I'm sure.
Yes, yes.
Tell me a little bit about some of the members of the group.
Yeah, we have Tim Smith on guitar. Tim has studied classical guitar, jazz guitar. He's also a very excellent composer himself. Mm-hmm. And we have Steve Bloom on various types of percussion.
I recognize Steve.
Yes. And Didier Proussard is on keyboards. I'm not sure if I pronounced his last name right, but he's studying up in Baltimore. He's from France. And we have Debu Nayak.
Welcome.
Who's originally from Calcutta. He's now living out in Virginia.
Good.
And so we've kind of got a, I guess these days, I don't know what, we don't really need a label, we just like the music, but some people call it world music.
World music, okay.
Whatever you want to call it.
Why don't you play another number? What was the first tune you played?
The first tune was called Facing East.
Okay, and that was just a smidge, that wasn't really...
Normally our pieces go on 15, 20 minutes, but
right.
You know, we have to sometimes fit things.
We bend for the program.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. What are you going to play now?
This next piece is a piece called Himalayan.
Okay, I'm going to move off and then take it away.
Great.
Well, I'm ready to climb the mountain now.
Yeah.
Very good. How'd you come up with the name Facing East?
It just sort of came to me one time. I just sort of makes sense that I'm not really an Easterner, but we're sort of looking that direction.
Okay, because I know Ravi Shankar once released a cut called West Eats Meat.
Yeah, I had.
Which I thought displayed a rare sense of humor.
West Eats Meat.
Right. Why don't we talk a little bit about the instruments?
Okay.
You mentioned the bonsai. What's Steve playing back there?
Well, Steve plays about 150 different instruments, but what he brought with him today is old types of congas and tambourines and bells and shakers and...
Right. We should mention some of the groups that Steve and Didier play in.
Yeah, Steve.
Mambo Combo. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And over here we have the Indian tabla.
Yes.
Tabla.
Yeah. Yeah. That consists of a right-hand drum and left-hand drum,
Right.
since it's treble and bass.
Yep, and it's almost like a talking drum. They can get different tones from it and different, they actually, it's not just a rhythm instrument, they actually get different pitches on that drum. And
So that gives us our sort of non-Western influences, and then
Yeah.
we have Tim on electric guitar,
yeah,
very much a Western influence.
right, and we have
Of course, the Kurzweil,
the ancient 5,000-year-old instrument, the synthesizer.
yes, also can be used as a straight piano if necessary.
Right.
This CD, it can be had in the Washington area, perhaps?
Yes.
Where can one find that?
House of Musical Traditions carries it.
And among other fine stores, I hope.
Borders Music is going to be
Borders,
carrying it.
fine store.
And yeah, it's around the area, and more places are carrying it.
Okay, it's selling really well, as I understand.
Yeah, I think it was one of the best sellers they said over at House of Musical Traditions.
Yeah, Tim says, you know, welcome to the House of Musical Traditions.
And he puts it in their face and says, you buy one now.
Right, this is a representation of every instrument in the store. I should mention that Tim composed the theme, wrote and played the theme to this show that we use every time it's on.
I wish we had more time, because Tim has written some really beautiful tunes. We just don't have time today to play all of them.
What I'd like to do is thank all of you for coming, and then maybe take us out with a tune.
Okay, it's a tune called Purnima.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Stay tuned for Writer's Block, author Sam Fulwood III on what happened to the dream of integration, followed by Copy House Forum and a conversation with EPA Administrator and Takoman Carol Browner.
Welcome to Writer's Block. I'm Lisa Page. My guest this edition is Sam Fulwood III, Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. His book, Waking from the Dream, My Life in the Black Middle Class, is a personal story of success and disillusionment. Juan Williams called it, quote, a terrific exploration of the inner life and outer events that make up successful young Black Americans today. Sam Fulwood is also a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. He contributed to his newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the 1992 Los Angeles riots. Thanks for being with us at Takoma Coffee House.
Glad to be here, Lisa.
Oh, it's really great. Your book is a memoir, Waking from the Dream, and I noticed that it came about through Jonathan Yardley, the columnist at the Post.
Yeah, some time ago, Yardley wrote a column. I can't remember exactly what he said in this column, but it was something I totally disagreed with. I didn't know Jonathan Yardley from Man in the Moon, but I called him up and took him on for what he was saying. And he says, well, that's an interesting argument you're making. Let's have lunch. And over a series of lunches, one lunch led to another, over a course of a year, we became friends. And after talking about life and personal experiences, he's from North Carolina, I'm from North Carolina. He went to the University of North Carolina.
Oh, really?
I went to the University of North Carolina. He worked on the Daily Tar Heel, I worked on the Daily Tar Heel. We found that we had some things in common. We had a lot that were not in common. He's from a different generation, he's much older, he's white, and I'm different. And we found that in talking about some of our similarities and our differences, he sort of blurted out to me, you ought to write a book about your life. And as it turned out, I was wanting to write a book about other people's lives that sort of paralleled mine. And he says, well, you know, you're not selling that book. Why don't you sell the one that people would buy from you? And that's how a memoir idea came about, rather than doing a nonfiction book, which is what I wanted to do.
Oh, interesting. And you have a specific message in here, really. When you say waking from the dream, it is, what dream are you waking from?
Well, in my mind, it's sort of a double entendre. When people talk about race and the dream, the operative motif is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. People think of that as sort of a defining moment. We also think about, in my mind, you think about the American dream, the idea that you can start from humble beginnings. If you work hard, play by the rules, do everything right, you can pull yourself up and maybe one day even be president.
Right.
My sense of it is that both of these dreams are flawed when you start thinking about African Americans and our experience in this country. But I didn't know that as a child. I believed in sort of the American dream of hard work and success at the end of hard work, as well as sort of this notion of a colorblind society that Dr. King talked about in his March on Washington speech. I think that when people are dreaming, they're not really working to make either one of those things happen. And that a lot of people have sort of been lulled into believing, being complacent about the dream motif, that they're not really doing the hard work that it takes to create a true American dream society or a true colorblind America. And that's what I'm talking about. I have awakened from that blind belief that just in doing the right things will ultimately lead you to this sort of promised land.
You know, and you have a section in your book where your daughter asks you, do we have a perfect life, Daddy? And you're, I mean, you're saying to me, no, this is not a perfect world at all, and yet it seems to me in the course of the book, you sort of come to that. I mean, in the beginning, you too are looking, oh, isn't this wonderful, and the future's so bright.
The book begins with me talking about how, growing up in Charlotte, I genuinely believed I had the perfect life. My neighborhood was just pristine, it was green, and the pine trees, and all the kids seemed perfect. We were all black, we were all, by the standards of that day, middle class. We didn't know anything about what was going on in the outside world, outside of our neighborhood. And that to me was idyllic and perfect. My daughter has a similar kind of experience some 30 years later, 40 years later. And that's what I'm talking about. All kids believe that their childhood is as perfect as it can be. It's when you get older and you realize what it takes to maintain that facade of perfection that we have to grapple with. And that's what the whole notion of perfection is what I'm talking about. I bookend the book, or bracket the book, with these two childish notions of perfection. Mine as a kid growing up in the late 60s in North Carolina, and my daughter as a kid in the late 90s growing up in suburban Washington.
Yes. And you have many points in the book where you wake up. I mean, several sort of revelations where, and one that I'm struck with that I'd like you to read a little bit from is when you're in South Africa working as a correspondent and you're talking with the South African woman. Well, if you would read it, please.
Sure, I'll be glad to.
It sort of encapsulates the struggle that Black Americans go through, but through a South African's eyes.
One afternoon, I was denied lunch in a Chinese restaurant at a North Johannesburg suburban shopping mall. As before on my nightclub adventure, I was in the company of the same white-looking South African woman, but this time the rejection was different. For her, it dredged up all the personal woes she associated with not belonging in her native land. She had carefully picked this particular restaurant, having eaten there once previously as the business guest of a Black South African woman. So the snub came as more of a personal shock, as an affront to her inability to navigate the conventions of her own society in the presence of an American. At the waiter's refusal to seat us, I lost my appetite and turned to leave the restaurant. My dining partner, however, girded herself for a noisy confrontation. She would not go quietly, or at least not without a moral victory. I noticed the diners deep inside the place rubbernecking to see what was happening. I wanted to leave without an incident and whispered my feelings to her, thinking my hushed tones could avoid the noise I felt her capable of producing. I've eaten here before, so why can't my friend and I enter now? She said with the indignation of a scorned Black woman everywhere. I could almost feel her tears welling up, but I knew she would never allow the waiter to see her cry. I'm sorry, madam, the waiter said. I can't. I want to see the manager, she said. Her voice was now trembling with frustrated rage. Let's forget it, I said. I don't want to eat here after all this. Later, when I persuaded her to talk about why she had been so angry, the tears flowed freely. It was the unexpected, she explained, the not knowing when and why someone would treat her as though she did not belong. She was colored by fiat of a government that she neither supported nor trusted. Her life in South Africa had been a mixed blessing, both unique and typical of the lives of people caught in circumstances they could neither control nor change. She was too dark to be white and too light to be Black. We are all mongrels in this country, she said. Her tears had dried by this time as we sat in her studio apartment in a high-rise apartment building in the center of Johannesburg. She lived there with a wink and a nod from the landlord, who was by law forbidden to rent the place to anyone other than white South Africans. The apartment reflected the spirit of its occupant. It was a study in contrast with its blend of appointments collected from her travels to New York, Paris, and Kinshasa, as well as her nomadic life across South Africa. Her ancestry was that of a colored person from the Himalayan slaves brought to South Africa in the 19th century, but her birth certificate and other identity papers register her as an Asian Indian in recognition of her Muslim upbringing and her colored Methodist mother's choice for schooling her. By the time she was in the 6th or 7th grade, she had decided she had no use for school, having been expelled for fighting or skipping classes more times than she could remember. 2 unsuccessful marriages later, she had become educated by dint of mothering 3 children and traveling the world with her second husband, a successful but aloof Zairian businessman who commuted between Kinshasa and New York, sans wife or children. I grew up being able to relate to Blacks, whites, and Indians, she told me. I have many white friends and many Black friends, but I don't belong in either community. I have always been able to move into and out of any situation that was put in front of me. Always felt that I should have been born an American. I'm American, I thought. There's not much difference between your life and mine. I wish I had asked her how much difference she thought it would make if she had been a Black American. But I did not think of the question, not yet having posed it to myself, and so the opportunity passed for exploring just how different her life was from mine. Judging by my view of South Africa, from the luxury suite at the Carlton Hotel, I could see how she got the false impression that I did indeed have it made. I was treated as an American VIP.
Thank you. And that's the essence, I think, that of this memoir that you keep coming back to, is transgressing all these different boundaries of race, and that it's this sort of black middle class angst in terms of you're dealing with blacks, you're dealing with whites, but you're also crossing other roads.
I think, Lisa, one of the things that's really defining about the point in time that all of us live in, black, white, and whatever, is that particularly for black Americans, never before in our history have we ever lived without the imprimatur of segregation and second-class status by fiat, by law, over us. We're now a generation, almost a generation and a half, away from the laws deeming us to be second class. And we're grappling with understanding that. And that, my generation, I'm 40 years old, is the first to have sort of come through that. We vaguely remember some of the scars, those of us who grew up in the South, vaguely remember some of the scars of segregation. I barely remember that. My daughter knows nothing of it. And that's what I'm really talking about, is this sort of foot in one world kind of existence where we recognize the limits, but we've also burst so many of them. Much of the work that I want to do, either whether it's in fiction or nonfiction, will be sort of grappling with this sort of two-ness, as Du Bois called it, of sort of being American and being black, but at a particular time when we're not really looking at it as the oppression of segregation defining who we are.
Because we still wear the mask, or but we don't always wear the mask. In the sense of the
quite
time.
honestly, a lot of people can live very successful lives and not. I mean, they can blend in without really being burdened by the burden of race. For some people, race isn't. Some black people, race isn't the primary thing that motivates them. For some people, it may be gender, or it may be sexuality, or it may be what part of the country, or their religion. Those kinds of things are...
Or their economic status.
Those kinds of things now help define people in a way that a generation ago or 2 generations ago were not possible, because race was the only determinant of who you were.
And you talk about what's your expression, the elders of
the Negro Community Guardians.
The Negro Community Guardians who look out for the community. And I was saying that in a sense maybe you are the next generation of that, in terms of trying to lay some groundwork for how to cross some of these.
Well, I guess all of us who care about the society in some way or another do that. That was a term I coined in the book for all of those old school teachers, those old black school teachers who had indeed labored in segregated schools, with the one-room school with the pot-bellied stove in the middle, and everybody learned, and they had so much pride in teaching hard-headed boys and girls to read and write, thinking that an education was going to be their ticket into a better life. And they were other groups of people would call race people. Well, I grew up in a community surrounded by these guardians, and they were always on the lookout for what was going to advance the race. And I think that there are people who are doing that. I don't know that I see myself quite as nobly as they did. But yeah, I'm interested in those things.
And you're trying to address them in the sense of preparing the next group behind you. And that's really important, I think. It's also, the book is a virtual who's who of black journalists. It is just, I mean, Nathan McCall, Patrice Gaines, Jack White, Nat Shepard, you've got Charlene Hunter-Galtz.
One of the things I discovered is that it's a small world among black journalists in this country. We all tend to know each other. There are not that many. I mean, there's more now than there's ever been, but we do tend to know each other. And one of the things I was attempting to do is sort of show this community. When I started as a journalist, there were not very many mentors, and these were my mentors.
Right. Well, and see, and that's a lot of fun to go along on that ride. I mean, even as you confront diversity at times, it's also really entertaining, at least it was for me, to see the ways that you and your peers, wrap things up for each other. So, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thanks to Sam Fulwood for joining us. Again, his new book is Waking from the Dream, My Life in the Black Middle Class. It's available at Chuck and Dave's bookstore in Takoma Park. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
Hi, and welcome to Coffee House Forum. I'm Mark Cohen. She is the youngest major agency head in the Clinton administration and a longtime resident of Takoma Park. Carol Browner is charged with perhaps the most important public health job in America, ensuring the quality of the air we breathe and the water that we drink. We talked with Carol Browner at EPA headquarters on May 13th about her career, about life in Takoma Park, about her environmental priorities, and she even agreed to field a few of our unusual multiple choice questions. Welcome. First of all, how should we address you? Madam Administrator, Ms. Browner, Carol? What would
Carol.
you prefer? Carol, you prefer? All right. Well, welcome to Takoma Coffee House, Carol. You grew up in South Florida. Were you an only child?
No, I have 2 sisters. I'm the oldest of 3.
And your parents both taught at Miami-Dade Community College. What did they teach?
My father just retired after 30 years as an English professor, and my mother continues to teach political science.
When you were, say, 10 years old, what did you imagine you'd become when you grew up?
Well, when I was growing up, there weren't a lot of role models for young women, and in fact, my father once asked me and my 2 sisters what we wanted to be when we grew up, and he had us write down on a piece of paper. I wanted to be a secretary. My sister, the middle daughter, wanted to be a beautician. She is today a PhD molecular biologist. And my youngest sister, who is today a PhD English professor, wanted to be a file clerk.
Fast forward a few years to 1970, the first Earth Day. You were, what, a sophomore in high school at the time. Did that event register for you?
It did register for me. I certainly remember, for example, the photographs of the Cuyahoga River burning. I remember pictures from across the country of the large numbers of people who stood up and said, no more pollution, we have to save our air, our water, our land.
But no personal involvement at that point, no.
Well, I was always very involved in my local community, including things like working in migrant labor camps with children, going out into the Everglades, doing cleanup projects. My family was very, very active in the local community in terms of both public service and enjoying our local environment.
And then you went on to undergrad school at the University of Florida and got your law degree at the University of Florida. Were you becoming more politically or environmentally engaged, consciously, as opposed to kind of community service orientation?
Well, I knew by the time I went to college that I really wanted to do something to help others. And I had announced to my parents as I went off to college that I thought I should be a lawyer, that was a very good way to help people and to try and make the world a better place. And I did have the experience in my last year of law school of actually working for a legal aid society where I was involved in cases representing battered women and individuals who were trying to leave very difficult situations. From that experience, I came to believe that you could do a lot of good in individual cases, but you could probably do much more good if you became active on the policy side. So I graduated from law school and went to work for the Florida legislature.
And immediately became a general counsel to the Government Operations Committee in the House?
As soon as I passed the bar, yes.
That's pretty remarkable. I think a lot of people would like to know how you got on that career path and were able to jump into a position like that.
Well, I was very lucky to have worked while I was in law school. I worked all the way through college. I put myself through college and law school by working as a secretary, typing. In my first 2 years of college, I worked full-time during the day and I went to school at night. Then I had enough money so I could actually go to school during the day and work part-time. But because of that, I had the opportunity to meet some really wonderful people. I worked in a law firm. I met some lawyers involved in some very important Supreme Court cases who were influential and served in some ways as mentors to me. And when I was in law school, I worked part of the time for sort of a public interest think tank. The man who founded that had gone on to the Florida legislature and eventually became the Speaker of the House. And so through my work with him, I decided that working in the Florida legislature is something that I would enjoy doing. And it's there that I really began my first professional work on the environment.
Yeah, but you moved to Washington not long thereafter. The Washington area were on staff with Citizen Action, a progressive grassroots citizens organization, and you met your husband there, is that right?
I came to Washington and met my husband, working for a grassroots citizens organization, working on community right to know legislation. And in fact, one of the really wonderful things about my position here as head of the country's environmental agency is I've been able to take a law that I worked with a number of others to see become the law of the land and expand its application. It's been one of my really great pleasures here that I've been able to give the public access to more information about toxic chemicals in their neighborhoods.
And how long, you bought a house in Takoma Park about that time?
No, when I first came to Washington, I actually didn't even know about Takoma Park. I lived on Capitol Hill, as I think many people do, and started to learn about various parts of the city and discovered Takoma Park after I had been here a few years and knew almost instantly that it is where I wanted to ultimately move.
And why?
I knew people out there and I would visit them and feel this tremendous sense of community. This sense of people working together to make their quality of life better, a wonderful place to raise children. I did not have a child at that time, but I could just see these beautiful parks on a Sunday afternoon filled with young children and parents. And every time I went there, I felt better.
And so what year did you move there?
Moved to Takoma Park in, oh God, you're going to edit this? I have to do math here real quickly. I moved to Takoma Park 11 years ago.
Okay. And we're going to come back to that in a minute, but back to your biography a little bit. You went to work for then Senator, now Governor Lawton Chiles, and then you became legislative director to then Senator Al Gore, which I gather has had some impact on your current career.
I've had the great fortune to work with a number of outstanding elected officials. I joined Senator Chiles' staff as a legislative assistant focusing on environmental issues both in the state of Florida and nationally. About a week before my son was born, he announced that he would not be running for re-election. So I had
not your son, but Senator Chiles.
Senator Chiles would not be running for re-election to the United States Senate, and I had a year within which we were able to do some wonderful things for Florida in terms of preserving some of the very special places that were undeveloped and bring them into public ownership. When Senator Chiles left, he thought he would be done with political life at that point in time. I was fortunate to meet then Senator Al Gore and to join him as his legislative director.
But there was a period between doing that and coming to Washington as EPA Administrator, and that was when you were the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Resources, right?
No, it actually works out a little bit differently.
Okay.
I went to work for Senator Chiles about 10 years ago. He announced he would not run for re-election to the Senate. I joined Senator Gore's staff as his legislative director, focused on a number of issues, not the least of which was the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Senator Gore was one of the senators who led the effort to strengthen the public health and environmental protections embodied in that law. I was then returned to Florida when Senator Chiles became Governor Chiles and joined his administration as the head of the Florida Environmental Agency.
You're not only the administrator of EPA, but you're also very involved in the community and the PTA. I'm wondering how you balance your role as the youngest leader of this administration with your community life.
Well, I see the two as fitting together very nicely. Going home to Takoma Park, going to Piney Branch Elementary with my son, Babe Ruth baseball, as a way of staying very connected.
What team is he on?
He just got assigned to a new team. And he came home and told me the name was Calzones.
Oh, okay, good.
So, but my husband actually will be one of the coaches this year, and I think I get to be the third base coach as I was last year. But it's an opportunity for me to remember why I do this work. Obviously, my professional responsibility is for the country's environment, the public's health, our air, our water, our land. When I go home at night, I remember I do this in large measure for my son and all the children in the country.
And I could testify that you don't like to do other things work-related at night because it was impossible to schedule this interview at night with you.
No, I like to, if at all possible, if I'm not traveling, I am at home having a family dinner.
You were talking about Takoma Park and why it appealed to you before. Do you see it as a real, a truly committed, environmentally conscious community?
Absolutely. I think it's a community that places a real premium on environmental protection, a premium, if you will, on quality of life. I think that's true in communities across the country, but I think there's something very unique to the people of Takoma Park about their environment, about their quality of life. And they really, I think, can pride themselves on being willing to make tough decisions that have resulted in an improved quality of life.
It might be tough for you, I imagine, living in a neighborhood where just within the few square blocks around your own house there are leaders of a number of environmental organizations who you probably encounter inadvertently or maybe intentionally occasionally, but that they probably have an agenda they'd like you to be listening to, and I imagine that you're pretty busy and would like to avoid that sometimes. Is that a problem for you?
Well, the other thing I enjoy about Takoma Park is the opportunity to talk to people. And in fact, I always enjoy when people approach me and raise particular issues. I have to say, I think people are very respectful of the fact that if I'm with my son, I'm on my family time. If I'm gardening, since I am an avid gardener, I'll frequently be in the yard and people will come by and talk. But they're generally inclined to talk about what it is I'm planting or where Zachary and I may be headed, and respectful of the fact that it is family time.
You've made protection of children a centerpiece of your approach as the administrator of the EPA. Why?
When you look at our children, when you understand that they breathe more air per pound of body weight than an adult, they drink more water per pound of body weight, eat more food per pound of body weight, you realize, and the science shows, that they will be affected differently by pollution in the environment. And what I have directed the agency to do is, in setting public health and environmental standards for air, water, toxic chemicals, to ensure that we set them at a level that protect the most vulnerable among us, which are generally our children. I know that if we protect our children, we will be protecting the population at large. And that is my job. It is not simply to protect some in the population, it is to protect all.
All right, some multiple choice questions. First, the Air Quality Standards Coalition, an industry group fighting against tightening standards for smog-causing ozone and soot, is A, concerned citizens exercising their democratic prerogative to influence public policy, B, unrepentant polluters who would rather spend big bucks lobbying Congress than meet reasonable public health goals, C, both of the above, D, neither of the above.
I don't think it surprises anyone who pays attention to public health and environmental debates in this country that there are some in industry who have a vested interest, quite frankly, in the status quo, who don't believe they have an obligation to reduce their pollution of the public's air, and they will go to extremes, if you ask me. They will engage in scare tactics. They will spend huge amounts of money, which they are doing in this case, to present their point of view to the public. My job in setting a public health air quality standard, which we are in the process of doing, we have not made a final decision, but we will do so come the middle of July. My job is to look at the science, to understand exactly what the science shows us, and to set a standard that clearly protects the health of the American people, and that is what I will do. I am sure some in industry will oppose me until the very end.
I'm sure you're right. You receive in the mail on the same day 4 invitations for a dinner party scheduled for 2 Saturdays hence. You've got nothing else scheduled, and your family wants to go to one of the dinners that you choose. Here are your options. A dinner at the Vice President's mansion with Alan Tipper Gore and key reinventing government agency officials and their spouses. B, a dinner with the directors and spouses of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Sierra Club, and several other environmental organizations at the Audubon Naturalist Society. C, a dinner at Blackie Steakhouse with the leaders of the Air Quality Standards Coalition. D, a dinner with Takoma Park City Council and their significant others at the home of Mayor Ed Sharp.
We'll stay in Takoma Park any night we can.
Okay. If you weren't administrator of EPA, what job would you most like to do?
I think that the most important thing you can do is give something back to your community, engage in public service, and there are many wonderful ways to do that. I think of the teachers at Takoma Park Elementary, at Piney Branch Elementary that I've come to know. They're all wonderful public servants. They're making a huge difference. I think of the people who are willing to give their time to the city government. Many of them have full-time jobs. The people who serve on the Historic Preservation Society boards. When I leave this job, and in our form of politics I will eventually leave, I will make sure that I continue to be involved in some way in giving something back to my community and to my country.
In Takoma Park or in Florida, do you think?
Will I go back to Florida someday? Florida is my home. It's an important part of who I am, and I do look forward to someday returning to Florida. I will tell you that Zachary says Takoma Park is his home, so we'll have to see.
Finally, if you had to rank what you consider to be the 3 biggest environmental concerns, not only of this country, but of the planet, what would you say?
I think the 3 biggest problems are, 1, the public health impacts of pollution. While we have made tremendous progress in reducing the amount of pollution in this country, we see growing numbers of cancer, a growing amount of asthma. Asthma is now the single largest cause of childhood hospitalization in the United States. Breast cancer, prostate cancer is on the rise. Growing concerns about drinking water, microbial contamination. So the impact of pollution levels on the public health. Second, our ability to really manage growth, to deal with the fact that we continue to grow. Maryland's example of growth. I think the governor deserves a lot of credit for putting forth a policy that would manage the growth pressures in Maryland to honor the quality of life, to honor environmental standards, but certainly how we manage growth in the coming decades will be very, very important in terms of our ability to provide environmental and public health protections, most particularly air quality. As we drive our cars more and more, that will obviously impact the quality of the air we breathe. Third would be the amount and the availability and quality of water. And that is not just a problem here in the United States, but it's a problem, an increasing problem worldwide. So 1 is the public health impacts of pollution. 2 are the impacts of growth on environmental quality, including air pollution, water pollution. And 3rd is the availability of fresh, clean water.
Thanks so very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks.
I know you're very busy.
Do you need anything else?
Not from you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Great.
Well, we spoke with Carol Browner at EPA headquarters on May 13th. That wraps up this edition of Coffee House Forum. And so until next time, and even thereafter, I'm Mark Cohen for Takoma Coffee House.